Okay.
Yeah, so
Perfect.
let me just check. We are indeed recording. All right, cool. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Hope you're keeping safe, staying warm. Yeah, thanks for joining us in the middle of the week. So most of you probably already know Justin. I usually joke and say that he's kind of my go-to typography guy, but in a sense that is correct. Like if I were to open my Slack discussion with him, my Slack DMs with him probably now, like it'll probably be 50% just like FedSA stuff and like 50% just random typography questions. So yeah, like I can highly vouch for this guy. And in fact, like I remember when I just started out as a front-end developer, I attended one of his talks on typography. And at that point I was still doing WordPress, and I remember like I was just thinking like, okay, so how, this is cool and everything, but how do I implement this in WordPress? But yeah, so I think without further ado, let me just give Justin the floor. I think we can maybe do some housekeeping, general announcements and so forth afterwards. Cool.
Okay. Thanks, Skok. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Let me just share my screen. Is that all visible to everyone? Yes? Okay, hang on. Sorry. I have this Zoom thing in. Okay, there we go.
Okay, looks good on my side.
Right. Gee, this slide's background is making me look very, very pale. Anyway. Okay, so the topic for tonight, for my talk, is dynamic and performant web typography. And by that I mean I'm going to be looking at, how do we go about selecting a font, which is, based on a number of kind of fairly solid principles, but there's a lot of leeway within that as well. So, there are no real hard and fast rules. I'll just cover a few things that you can consider looking at when you want to select something. We'll look at fonts in the browser. That is, we'll look at a kind of a very short history of how we've displayed fonts and typography within the browser, start going all the way back to the 90s. We'll look at performance, which is a really important aspect to all of this. The designer in me goes, yay, fonts, typography, let's do it. And then the front-end dev in me goes, hang on, this is a real performance problem. Do we really want to do this? So we need to balance those two concerns. One is in design and aesthetic concern, and the other one is a performance and accessibility concern. So I'll cover a few techniques that you can use there to optimize your font loading and to make your site as fast as possible. And then we'll look at responsive type. And we'll look at two things in responsive type. The one is we'll look at creating fluid typography. So we'll be looking at how to scale your type across different device widths and screen sizes. So now we tend to write a media query and we have a font size, and then we write another media query and we have another font size. And when we move between those, there's usually a nasty jump. It's not smooth. So we'll look at ways of smoothing that. And then we'll also look at variable fonts. So in 2006, Oliver Reichenstein, I don't know if anyone's heard of him. I always put this quote in my typography presentations. This is 14 years ago. So Oliver Reichenstein is the founder of a company called Information Architects. And I guess the thing they're most known for is a Mac app called IA Writer, which was one of the very first kind of markdown writing apps for the Mac. It's still probably the best one there's ever been. But his company also does a lot of web design in the media space, and in particular, they design for newspaper websites. And he is Swiss, and the company's based in Japan, and they do a lot of multilingual designs. So they really understand type incredibly well. They even designed their own website for their font, or their own website for their font. Let me rephrase that. Font for their website. So he kind of said this, and this is the name. This is actually the title of the article. Web design is 95% typography. It was kind of a notorious and infamous statement at the time, because it was in the middle of, the YouTube arriving on the scene, MySpace, all these multimedia things where people were going mad with all of that. And this was kind of his counterpoint to what people were doing then, because no one was paying any attention to type. It was a mess. If you ever visited GeoCities, you'd know what I'm talking about. So very, very messy. So the assertion really here is that 95% of the information on the web that we consume is written, okay, and consists of words and letters. And that every web designer should be well versed in the discipline of shaping written information. And that discipline of shaping written information is what we can usually call typography. And if you're writing CSS in any way, you're a typographer. You really are, because you are making all those decisions around font size, around line height, around line length, around kerning, around letter spacing, around whether you're going to use open type features and all these types of things. So we're all really doing it as soon as we start to write CSS. And CSS, the impetus to actually just start CSS and make it a thing comes from wanting to present type. The first properties we got in CSS were related to type, and they were around font family, font size, and color. So CSS begins with typography. And we're reading type on the screen all the time. Emails, messages on WhatsApp, or whatever it might be. So type on the screen is extraordinarily important. Okay, so that's my long and rambling introduction. Let's move on. We're going to start with choosing a typeface. And I'm going to give some kind of general ideas, and then we'll look at a few examples. So strangely enough, I always start here. How much money have you got? And how much is this font going to cost you? And this is a really important question, because you can go the free route and you go to Google Web Fonts or whatever you want to do. Or you can go for a paid-for typeface. And this can become very expensive. And I just want to show an example of how expensive this can be. So this is, can everyone see the browser window okay?
Yep, good on my side.
Yeah. Okay, so this is Hoefler & Co., which is a really well-known type design studio. And this is probably their most well-known font, Gotham. This was the typeface of Barack Obama's first president, or actually all his presidential campaigns. And that's really where it became a really super famous font. But it's also a very, very nice font, as you can see, just looking at it there. So I've gone, okay, we want to use Gotham and we want to use it on the web. Okay, but we're also going to need to license it to use on our computers, so we can, on our laptops or whatever we're doing, so that we can do those designs before we turn them into HTML and CSS. So I'm going to say, okay, maybe we've got two designers, so we will need this for 2 computers, and we've got a website with up to 250,000 page views per month. Okay, and that's the lowest that you can select on Hoefler & Co. It goes, so this is from 0 to 250,000. And we'll go Gotham Scream Smart for the web, and look how much money we're paying, $507. Okay, so that would be to use Gotham, and even doing that, we are not now licensed either to host this web font ourselves. We have to host it via Hoefler's servers, which has all sorts of performance issues and complications. So here we're just looking at one typeface. Obviously, Gotham has a number of different weights and styles, but we're only getting the Gotham family here. We're not getting narrow, we're not getting extra narrow, we're not getting condensed. If we want all of those, we're spending over $2,000, which is, by last count, around $32,000. And that's not a once-off cost, that's a recurring cost, because your license has to be renewed every year. That's super expensive, right? I think we would all agree with that. And for most, small website builders or things, those are that kind of expense is out of the question. So looking at paid for fonts, they get expensive really, really quickly. So the other option, of course, is you can go to Google Web Fonts, and there are lots of good fonts on Google Web Fonts. There's nothing wrong with them. Google commissions font designers to type designers to actually create these fonts, and they pay for them. So even though you're getting them for nothing, they are not just randomly created by someone as a side project or a hobby. They're proper type designers who work on them. The problem, of course, is that you lose any kind of originality or individuality you might have within your design. So if we look at the analytics for Google Fonts and we see how many, these are the requests. This is live, it's running, and it's monitoring requests for web font files from the Google servers. And you can see it increases at a frightening pace. And if you look at something like, okay, we'll ignore Roboto because that's in all Google apps, etc. But if we look at Open Sans, which is an extremely popular font, and it's a very nice font, I've used it before. But in the last 7 days, there have been, I don't even know how big that number is. Like, what is it? 28 billion. 28 billion downloads in the last 7 days of Open Sans. Okay. So that tells you how many sites are using that particular font. So it's a great font, but you're losing any kind of individuality that you have. So you need to kind of weigh these considerations. What's the price? Can I afford to actually get a premium font? Now, I use Gotham as an example, and Gotham is particularly pricey. You can go to other places like myfonts.com and get good typefaces for less than that, but it's still going to cost you, and it's always going to be in dollars as well. Okay, so budget and format. What is the price? The second thing you need to look at is what web formats are available. You might come across a great font, but it's not available for the web. It's only allowed for print, sorry. And that is the case with many of these typefaces. And can you self-host? So this is something I'll deal with in more detail later. I'm very reluctant to allow other services to deliver my font files. Google, for the reason that, although they don't explicitly state it, I am 100% convinced they're tracking you. And that is a privacy issue for your visitors, and that's something that I don't like. So I will never, ever use Google Web Fonts. You also, the chances of Google servers going down are slim, but they do exist. And if you haven't set up your fallbacks properly, you could end up with a site that's not going to load because of server issues that are not under your control. The other issues we have with font CDNs and delivery networks is you're forced to use their method for loading and displaying fonts. So you wouldn't be able to go and devise your own CSS, and in some cases JavaScript, and in other cases like preloading and prefetching rules, because they don't allow it. Adobe Fonts in particular is very prescriptive about what you can and cannot do in terms of loading files. And some of them force you to use JavaScript, which to my mind is a terrible, terrible idea, because we're using JavaScript to solve what is a display issue. And JavaScript should never be used to change presentational things, in my opinion, on this level. Yeah. Changing states and so on, of course, that's what JavaScript's for. But using JavaScript to create presentational display items is a no-no in my book. Although that doesn't stop lots of people from doing it. I just think it's poor practice. And then, like, really crucially, what's the license? So type foundries can be pretty sticky around copyright. They've sued a number of people for using fonts without permission, particularly in the US. People have received fines within the hundreds of thousands of dollars, actually, for using fonts without the correct license. Now, anything that's on a site like Google Fonts or your other free font foundries, places like Font Squirrel and so on, generally have what's called the Font Open license, which means that you are allowed to pretty much do what you like with that typeface, except you may not distribute it for profit. Okay, so you can't go and sell it after you've created it. If you change something in it, for example, you change one of the glyphs, you can't then go and sell that font under that license. And most of them are licensed like that. Paid for fonts, all the licensing items are different. So you need to see, well, how many websites can I use it on? Am I only allowed to use it on one? Or can I use it on all the sites that I've built? And so on and so on. So budget and format is like the first thing that you should be considering. Can I pay for something? Yes, I can. How much can I spend? And then you can go and work within those parameters, or like, no, I can't. And then, you need to go and look for something that has an open font license that allows you to do that. Always try and self-host as you have granular control over your font loading. And as you'll see later, you can also control the size of your font files. Okay, so once we've considered that, really we should be considering a function and form. And in this case, we're talking about the relationship between our letters and our content. Are we displaying a large headline, or are we displaying small body text? Some typefaces are more appropriate and work better at large sizes, others work better at small sizes. Some don't work at all and are illegible at small sizes. So that would really be our next question. What are we displaying? What does it look like in terms of the content? And then how would we best represent that and make it readable and legible? Right, so let's look at a couple of letter forms. And in this case, we're going to look at the letter A. So we play Spot the Typeface or not? No. Okay, so this one is Gotham Ultra. It's the boldest version of the Gotham font family. And that, of course, is the lowercase a. The next one is Gotham Book, which is kind of the regular, or if in CSS, if we were saying font size normal or 400, this would be the typeface that we are representing here. The next one is Baskerville. The next one is Bodoni Old Style. The next one is SF Pro Text. And the last one is Lucidograd. Now, you can see these are all very, very different. Okay, and but one thing I've done here is they're all the same size, so they're all 200 points, and they are all aligned according to the baseline of the font. And you can see how different those things are. Yeah, you can see how different those things are across these typefaces. So, as a rule of thumb, we look at, when we're looking for legibility, if you look at the letter A and you can see the white space in the letter A, you can see that on Gotham Ultra, that white space is really small. Yeah. You can see on Gotham Book that it's much larger. So we have the same typeface, but two variants of it. And you'll see how the white space changes there. So that space inside a letter form like we have on the A there is called the counter. So the more open your counter or larger your counter, the more readable your text is for body copy because it's readable at small sizes. If you imagine that first one there, Gotham Ultra, at like 16 pixels, our browser default, it's not going to be legible at all. It's just going to look like a blob of ink, right? And that would never be printed at that size because the printer would not be able to render that correctly. So a font with a large counter is generally regarded to be more legible at small sizes. A font with a small counter can be legible at large sizes. And we don't necessarily want to have fonts with large counters at large sizes, because then they actually tend to be less readable because the white space tends to overtake the rest of the letter form. So a font with old style figures, if we look at Baskerville and Bodoni, you can see those are serif fonts as opposed to the sans serif Gotham. They have what are called terminals. Sorry, they all have terminals. You can see the difference between a sans serif and a serif font. But you can see that those are actually quite open. So they're readable at a fairly small size. And then the last two there, SF ProText, second from the end, you can see is actually the default operating system font on Macs, which has taken over from what it was Helvetica. It's now SF ProText. And you can see that's open. It's designed to be read at really, really small sizes. If you think about file names within Finder windows and things like that. And then the last one is Lucida Grand, which I'm sure we have all come across before. It's been around forever. It's generally regarded to be one of the web-safe fonts. And that was specifically designed for the screen. It was never designed to be used in print. So it's got all the things that make for a good screen font. And one of the things is, if we look at the top of the A, and we'll see in SF text, the second last one, that it's cut off horizontally. So there's a very sharp line, and if we look at the ascender that is on the right-hand side of the font. Let me just come out of this. So if we look here, we'll see that's horizontal, very rigidly horizontal, and that is at 90 degrees. Okay. And that doesn't necessarily make for readability. We have a good counter which balances that, but at small sizes, because we have that closed-off terminal, it starts to look a little bit difficult to read. Whereas if you look at Lucida Grand, it's going the other way. This is very open, and we have the curved element on the outside, so it's not as rigid, and it makes it a lot easier to read. If we look at Gotham, a book, we can also see we don't have that closed-off terminal, okay, that we have in San Francisco, in SF text. Okay, so another example with the Q, just to indicate this principle, and again we can see the open counters and how those relate to each other, and the more open the counter, the easier and more legible it is on small text. So we would want to be looking at larger counters for small text, smaller counters for things like titles. Right, so here's the same typefaces, but this is the X, and you can see they're all very different. And we have a concept in typography called X height, and this refers to the height of the lowercase x. Okay, so the height of the lowercase x in a particular font. And this is a relative unit that we use for measuring the proportions of the lowercase letters. So when we say the X height of a font, we literally mean the height of the X. Okay, and what generally happens is that lowercase letters match that height. You'll see here again, these are all the same size. They're all 200 points, but their X height varies greatly across the different typefaces. And again, this has a lot to do with legibility. So let's take a word with an X, taxidermy, and you'll see here, this is SF text, SF ProText, and you can see the X height there. What is above the X height is called an ascender, and what is below the X height is called a descender. And in this case, we can see that SF ProText has a relatively large X height, okay, which generally regarded as being more readable. I say generally because it's not always the case. As I said, these aren't hard and fast rules. This is our Baskerville, and we can see here the X height in proportion to the ascenders and the descenders is a lot smaller, right? Okay, so we can see on the D and the Y and the I, the distance between the X and those items is a lot more pronounced. And if we look at them together, so again, 200 points, they're the same size, but the Essepro text is much bigger than the basketball in this case, and you can see how those X heights differ. So again, something to bear in mind when we are looking for readability is, which is better. So the kind of thinking is that typefaces with tall X heights have better legibility at small font sizes, as the white space within the letters is more legible. But that's not necessarily always the case. If you look at a font like Adele Sans, for example, you'll see it has a really high X height, but it's also very cramped. So when you look at that in small sizes, it doesn't necessarily look so good. Okay, so which one's better? It depends. General rule, X height large, more readable, X height small, less readable. But as I said, that's not a hard and fast rule. Just something to look at when you're thinking about selecting a font. Okay, so let's look at two more letters. And I'm going to ask you a question. Is this the same? Is this all done in the same font? Anyone?
I would say I would say yes, it is, because I'm expecting the answer to not be what I think it is. Otherwise, you wouldn't ask it.
You out-psyched yourself, Skulk. So this and this are Helvetica, and this are Arial. And what are the differences? It's quite hard to see until you look closely, right? So if you look at Helvetica, you can see the terminal that I mentioned before, very horizontal, very closed off. Look at the A in Arial, it's slightly at an angle on that terminal, and this isn't as closed off as a result. The tail on the A here on Helvetica is more pronounced than the tail on the A in Arial. And if we look at the S, we'll see again it's horizontal. These counters are very closed off, but on Arial there's a slight variation there, and we can see that it's actually at an angle. So Arial and Helvetica are very similar, but they're not the same. And these fonts, Arial and Helvetica, I've chosen them because they are so similar, and to demonstrate this, and because they're used so often. I mean, how many times have we written font family Helvetica, Neue, Helvetica, Arial, Sans serif? I imagine many, many, many times to get a default kind of sans serif font family and fallback that's going to work everywhere. So these are called grotesque, or more specifically neo-grotesque sans serif fonts. And they use very closed apertures, as we can see, as I've demonstrated that they're very closed. And they have these kind of folding upstroke ends, and that brings them very close together. So they're very compact, and it kind of makes similar letter forms difficult to distinguish. So these grotesque is kind of used as a synonym for sans serif fonts in general. And it dates back way back until around 1815, when we first started seeing the very first sans serif fonts that were coming into use. And sans serif fonts were originally mostly capitals. We didn't have any lowercase letters for them, and they were used for signage. And with capital letters, you have far less of these kind of closed elements because they're much more open. You'll also see that they're near equal widths. They're not quite monospaced, but the letters have a very similar width. And this is in opposition to other sans serif fonts like Geometric, which is made up of kind of near perfect circles and squares. And here the most famous Geometric sans serif is Futura. But then we also have what are called humanist sans serif typefaces. And these take inspiration from more traditional letter forms. And examples of these are Verdana, which was designed purely for the screen all those years ago, but newer fonts like Calibri, Tahoma, Trebuchet, and one I mentioned earlier, Lucidogrand. And I think these have an advantage over your grotesques and our neo-grotesques in that, first of all, they have a lot more personality, and secondly, they're a lot easier to read on the screen, particularly at small sizes. Okay, so the perennial question, should I use one or more typeface? So, personally, I think most of the time we can get away with one font family and variants thereof. And you see all that Gotham font family I showed earlier. You see all the variations of that from italics, different weights, condensed versions, etc., etc. So more often than not, we can get away with that. As a rule of thumb, I would not really use more than one custom font family that I'm loading in at a time. I would stick to one custom font family and then use a default font where I can. But as a project grows, you might need an appropriate typographic response to complexity. As web applications grow larger and larger, or websites grow larger and larger, you might need to introduce typographic responses to that size and that growth. So I tend to find as applications and sites scale, you need to rethink your typographical choices, and maybe you want to be introducing a different font for headings and things like that. But again, you want to keep them to a minimum for performance issues. Okay, another thing you should really pay attention to is glyphs. So a glyph just refers to the character within a particular font, and you want to make sure that your typeface has all the required glyphs and then has correctly designed diacritic marks, which I'll show an example of now. And then you also want to have correctly designed open type features like accents, fractions, small caps, and so on, because we want to be able to use these on our screens as well. And I'll talk a little bit about open type features a bit later. Right, so let's look at this word, facade. You'll see it has a diacritic there, the C. And if your font does not have that particular diacritic, you may end up with something like this. Okay, where you see, in this case, what's happening is, okay, we don't have quicksand, which is the font I've used. I mean, quicksand does have this diacritic. I just made this as an example. Let's say if quicksand didn't, that C diacritic is now being displayed in our default operating system font. And you can clearly see the difference there. Okay. Even worse, you use a diacritic and Unicode fails completely and you get something like that. Okay. This has happened to me before. It's not very pleasant because your typeface choice is pretty much rendered null and void. You have to start again. Okay. That font's just not going to work because it doesn't support the letters that you needed, the glyphs that you needed to support. Right. So, sorry, I think, yeah. Okay, so I'll come back to OpenType. Right, so that pretty much covers the kind of things you can ask around selecting a font. Mark Bolton, I don't know if anyone knows Mark Bolton. He's pretty well known for his writings on type on the web. And he's actually created an open source shared Google document that has like a checklist for font selection, which is really well done. It kind of runs through some of the things I've mentioned here and a few more as well. So I'll share that as well with everyone. It's well worth just getting hold of that document and just making a copy and using it when you're selecting a typeface. Okay, so let's go back in time, all the way back to the 1990s when I was young. Right, so fonts on the web in the 1990s. So Microsoft started a project called Core Fonts for the Web in 1996. And in this project, they got a whole bunch of typographers to start designing fonts for the screen. And this is where fonts we're very familiar with come from, like Arial and Verdana and Tahoma, Lucidagrand, and of course our favorite Comic Sans. These were all developed by Microsoft starting in 1996. So they recognized the need for fonts that would work well on the screen, and in particular on the web. And we also, in the 90s, had the kind of development, beginnings, and a slow adoption of CSS. Okay. So these things were happening at the same time. We had Microsoft developing fonts specifically for the web. We had the development of CSS, and we also had something rather hyperbolically called the font wars. And this was specifically around format. So there are kind of 4 organizations that have a really big say in typography, and in particular in type for screens. And this time there were 3 of them, and it was Apple, Adobe, and Microsoft. And they were all working on their own versions of font formats. Apple had what they called Apple Advanced Typography. Adobe had what was called Type 1, better known as TypeScript. Then there was TrueType, which Microsoft and Apple collaborated on, which I guess would be unheard of now. And then there was OpenType, which is what Adobe and Microsoft collaborated on. So there are all these, and there was this was literally called the font wars, and it was over which format, excuse me, let me just drink some water. Which format would win out? And the one that won out was OpenType, for a number of reasons, but mostly because it allowed thousands and thousands of characters within one font file. Before OpenType, if you wanted multiple language support, you needed a different font file for each language and so on. And OpenType allowed these all to be in one font file. Okay, so OpenType won this particular battle, and that's important because later on we'll be looking at OpenType features and how we can enable them on our sites. Right, so fonts in the browser. How many of us always, as a matter of course, without fail, remember to put a language attribute on our HTML tag?
I don't need to remember because I have boilerplate.
Because you just type HTML and hit tab. So I just started this because it's a really simple thing, right? You want your language rendering to be correct for the language that you're presenting your content in. And you need to indicate what the language is. EN is obviously English, FR for France, DE for Germany, DE for Germany, etc., etc., etc. And there are hundreds of language attributes that you can add to your HTML. If you add a left to right, a right to left language, for example, in your attribute, the browser automatically knows that we're looking at right to left text. So this is a simple thing, but it's an important thing. Never leave out your language attribute. It solves you so many problems. Like English doesn't have many diacritics in it, that C that we used earlier in FOUT, but a language like French has many, many diacritics, and German and Slavic languages in particular. And if you don't specify that that's your language in the HTML, those diacritics and marks aren't going to be rendered properly. So it's really, really important that you do that and know that. That's the first thing around fonts in the browser. It's a simple thing, but it's important. The next one is FontFace. At FontFace, it's such a weird name. Font and typeface in one weird contraction. And then with the CSS at symbol. So I'm sure we're mostly familiar with this. If we're working with CSS and we are working with fonts in our websites, we would have likely come across FontFace, and this allows us to include custom fonts. So the first browser to support custom fonts was Netscape Navigator 4 in 1994. I don't know if anyone other than me ever used Netscape Navigator. It was the browser that was to become Firefox, via the Mozilla Foundation and so on. So they, Netscape had a proprietary font format. It was called PFR, and you would load that in your head, and then you would wrap your, this is pre-CSS, you would then wrap your HTML in a font tag. So you would go H1, and then your H1 would then have the font tag, and then you'd put the font family within that font tag inside your HTML, and would then use a proprietary font that was available for Netscape. Netscape used something called a font service called Bitstream. But if you visited that site at that time in Internet Explorer, you would not see that font. In fact, you would see nothing except, some people may remember these, a Java applet that you had to run and then refresh the page in order to see the type. So it only worked in Netscape. IE, so IE has actually supported FontFace as we know it and use it today since 1997. Okay. Whereas it took until around 2012 for all the other browsers to properly implement it. IE has actually had it since 1997. And here's the proof from the defunct Browser News website from 1997, which you may gather from the amazing design. But embedded fonts in Microsoft IE for PR2. Okay. Hi, Dave. I just found out that Microsoft has included embedded font technologies in IE4 PP2. Microsoft implementation of this is great. This is a blessing for all web designers. Check out this link for more info and samples. Thanks for the tip, Sergio. Everyone was so nice back then.
I also like the fact that he included the .htm in the actual URL. I think it's also like a sign of the times.
Absolutely, definitely. Absolute URLs for the win. Yeah, so if you go and track this down actually on the web archive and you click that Microsoft.com typography blah blah link, it's still up actually. And you can go and see the amazing fonts. I say amazing in a slightly sarcastic way, that were available back then. So IE's actually supported this for a long time, but it used a proprietary format called embedded OpenType, and only IE could read embedded OpenType fonts. So just like with Netscape, you know, you would go to a site in your Netscape browser and you would read the font there because we designed it for Netscape and it would work fine, and you'd go in your IE browser and it wouldn't work, and vice versa. Which is often in the late 90s, you'd land on a website, and before you went anywhere, the site would ask you to please choose which browser you're using, and you would then go either to the site built for Netscape or the site built for Internet Explorer. Fun times. Building each website twice, because there was no such thing as cross-browser compatibility in a lot of these areas. Okay, so FontFace supported for a long time in IE, but it took the other browsers a long time to get up to speed, and it was only until around 2012 that we could start using FontFace everywhere. And this coincided with the advent of WOFF, or the Web Open Font Format, which was developed by Mozilla in 2009 and was adopted as a standard in 2012. And this is a compressed version of an OpenType font. So OpenType fonts are fairly large, and WOFF comes along and it says, okay, we're going to compress you, but you'll still retain all your glyphs and characters, which is great. And WOFF is then superseded in 2015 by WOFF 2, which led to a further 30% reduction in file size, which is great. And the font foundries and type designers were happy with WOFF because it can't be used in design programs or anything like that. It can only be rendered in the browser. So all the issues around font copyright and so on are rendered irrelevant via WOFF. Because the type foundries were a big stumbling block towards having fonts in the browser, because they felt that they were giving up their intellectual property. Right, so there's our standard, font face. Let's go and set up our font family. Let's say what file we're looking for. In this case, we're looking for WOFF2. If WOFF2 isn't supported, we're looking for WOFF. Our weight is normal and our style is normal. Now, nowadays, and you don't need the second line there of the source unless you need to support Internet Explorer. If you don't need to support Internet Explorer, you don't need that line. You can just go with WOFF2. WOFF2 is not supported in Internet Explorer, but WOFF is. Okay, so let's move on to our OpenType features. So I said OpenType, won out the font wars. And OpenType features are like extra things that you get within the font file that you can turn on or off. These are available in your design programs, and they always have been. Programs like Illustrator and InDesign and Photoshop and so on. Sketch, Figma, I don't know. So it's things like ligatures, so additional features that we might have font support, and they're not always appropriate to use, but some of them are critical for like really great typography. And we have a whole bunch of these, which you may or may not have heard of, like kerning, creating fractions, ligatures, small capitals, swashes, superiors, and there are over 100 of them. So let's just look at two examples. And one is ligatures, and this is the kind of strapline on my company's website. And there are two ligatures here. Anyone hazard a guess at where they might be?
I'm going to go with the
F and the I.
Sorry?
Financial.
That one. Yeah, there's one more.
Jonathan, you can take this one.
The F and the T in software.
Correct. Well done. So ligatures are where we have two letters that are very close together and might crash into each other. That's not the technical term, but that's kind of a good way to describe it. So F and I, F and T. I actually hate this F and I ligature in this font is later, and I actually switch it off by putting it in a span and then turning ligatures off, which is a bit of a pain, but I really don't like it. If you're a user of the Slack app, it uses this font, and you may see wherever, if you go in there and type FI and FT and so on, you'll see the ligatures in action. So that's a ligature. Let's take some letters that appear very close together, and we make them one glyph in order to so that they're more legible. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go to, how we deal with these. So there are two ways to do it in CSS. So we have in CSS we have the concept of a high-level property and a low-level property. And a high-level property in CSS is one that is finalized. Okay, this is its final form, and browsers must now implement it like this. A low-level property says, okay, you can start implementing these features, and this is the way that you can do it now. But just be aware that it might change as we go forward. And a good example of where we saw that was in Flexbox and Grid, where we had all these things like WebKit Box and WebKit Flex Flow and things like that were implemented, but then were not in the final spec. So we have the same thing with OpenType features. So font variant ligatures, common ligatures, is the high-level spec to enable ligatures in our typefaces. And font feature settings, Liga, that is, all OpenType features have a 4-letter acronym or abbreviation, Liga for ligature and CLig for contextual ligatures. There's so many resources on this out there. Just Google for OpenType features in the browser, and there are so many, as I say, so many resources. The ones on Adobe fonts in particular are very, very good. So that's how we would enable it. We'll put the high-level property first because of the cascade, the C in CSS. Does the browser understand this? Yes. If not, let's go on to the next one. And we can do it like this. We don't need to use @supports or anything like that, because this is non-destructive. It's purely presentational. It's not going to mess with any layout or anything like that. Okay, so let's just look at an example. Oh, I'm going to close this. So can everyone see that? It's a bit small. How's that?
Yeah, it looks good on my side.
Okay, look at this number. This is real data from one of the projects I work on. This isn't the table. I just whipped up this table. But this is real data. It's financial services. Look at that number. It's nuts. Okay, now look at the way the font is represented. You'll see that the numbers are, none of them are the same height, right? So again, numbers sometimes have X heights too, and that's a bit weird. Now that's really hard to read. And this is called old style numbers. And they're usually the default in a font. But this particular typeface, which if we go and have a look, is FOIT Sans Pro. Okay, and FOIT Sans Pro has a lot of open type features. And one of the open type features that it has is what we call line numbers. Can you see the change? Shall I do it again? Standard open type feature line numbers. So what line numbers does is it makes all the letters the same width and the same height. And they're your illegible, impossible to read numbers, and tables are changed to be a lot more readable. Of course, in this case, those numbers are too large to be readable anyway. And I've lost many fights trying to convince them not to include them, but that's another story. So that's just an example of a open type feature. And if we look in our inspector here, let me hang on, sorry. You'll see here table open type font feature settings LNum, and that then stands for our line numbers. And if I switch it off, we go back to the unreadable. I switch it on, and our numbers are all readable. So that's another good example of open type features and how we can use them. So as I said, there are over 100 of these. Not all fonts are going to support them, right? Only some open type features will be in some typefaces. And again, that's something that you'll want to investigate when selecting your font. As I said up front, we're displaying a lot of numbers. Does our typeface support line numbers? Okay, now on the next slide, I'm going to move on to performance, and I'm going to do a little bit of, I guess, boasting is the correct word. For my website, on Page Speed Insights, score of 100. Okay, and I am loading custom fonts there. This is the desktop version. I didn't include the mobile version because I only scored 99 on mobile, which I have to fix. Right. So I guarantee that one of the things that's going to mess up your page speed, your lighthouse, whatever kind of performance you're doing is loading custom fonts. So what can we do about that? Well, the first thing is, how does this work? So before a browser can show a web font, you need to download that web font over the network. Okay. But that download is only initiated once the browser detects the font family in the CSS file. So, and we all know that CSS is render blocking. So the browser must first download and parse your entire CSS file, find a font family declaration for that particular font, and then it will initiate the download. Okay. That's a big bottleneck, right? And especially if you have a huge CSS file and you've dumped your font family things right at the end. So, I mean, the first obvious thing here to do is, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So, and this leads to what we call either FOIT or a flash of invisible text, depending on your settings. So either your copy is just not visible at all, right? And what we might see are things like little icons, underlines, because those aren't dependent on the font, bullet points and so on. What the browser's actually done here is it knows there's text there because it's already got the HTML, right? It actually renders the HTML the same color as the background declaration. So your text is there. It's just, in this case, it's white. So it's painted white. And the browser actually repaints it once the font file is downloaded. So you can see there's another render blocking download issue in that we need to now repaint. So that's why we see things like underlines and bullet points and things like that, because the type is actually there. Yeah. It's just not visible until that font is downloaded. So that's flash of invisible text. This is really bad to my mind, yeah, and we should never do it. The other thing that we have is flash of unstyled text, where we might, for example, have something like this, and we can see it's in our standard sans serif browser safe font, in this case Georgia, and then our Droid serif, which is our custom font, loads, and we get that, right? So it flashes between it's unstyled, and then suddenly the font is downloaded and it's styled. I'm sure we've all seen that. Now, this is preferable to invisible text, yeah, because it's still readable. And if something happens on the network, remember that custom fonts on the web are always going to be networked texts. This is what Robin Rendell calls them. Yeah. They're always going to be networked, as in they're dependent on your internet connection. Yeah. If you have a really slow connection, that font file might never finish downloading. Yeah. So, that makes this unacceptable. But this, which isn't your first choice font, quite acceptable to my mind. Someone who isn't in here watching, and I have huge arguments about this from aesthetic reasons. But I think the usability factor outweighs the aesthetic factor in this case. I always think of custom fonts as progressive enhancement. Yeah. Always consider them that. So what can we do? Okay, first one is, just don't use custom fonts. Okay. And in that case, well, what am I talking about? Okay. So we can say to our browser and our users, let's not use any custom fonts. Let's use system fonts. Okay, so let's use the fonts that the operating system, whoever our users are using, all have default fonts. Let's just ensure that we use that. So we can set up a font family that looks something like this. In this case, we're saying Apple System, which will use the Apple System font, Blink Mac System font, which is for older versions. Let's use Sego UI, which is Windows 10. Let's use Roboto, which is Android. Let's use Oxygen Sans, Ubuntu, Cantarell, which are on various flavors of Linux. Let's use Helvetica Neue for old iOS and old Mac OS. And then finally, in case all of those fails, then just use the default sans serif. Okay. And we can do that. So that just says, like, use the default OS. This means your website is not going to look the same on different operating systems. So Mac, Windows, Linux, Android, iOS, those are all going to look different. And a prime example of this is GitHub. So if you go to GitHub, and this is my GitHub profile, please excuse the browser stack little menu in the bottom left. It was the only way I could take a screenshot. So this is Chrome on Windows 10 by a browser stack. And the font being used here is Sego UI, which is the Windows default system font. And this is what it looks like when I visited on my Mac. So there's Windows, and there's the Mac. So here it's using SF text. You can see this like really clearly if you look at my name in bold under my profile picture, Justin Slack. You can see how that changes within those two. So we're seeing different typefaces, but the layout remains the same. And that's just using a system font. So that's one option. You can make font families also for serif fonts. Georgia is shared across operating systems, And there's actually some really nice serif fonts that are available on the Mac, which you can then just fall back to. Your second option is to minimize downloads. And this is to go to your font face and say, use my font family Open Sans, use my font weight 400, but then add the local attribute to my source line. And this says, is this font installed on the user's operating system, on their computer, on their PC, their laptop, etc. And if that font is installed and it's available locally, it's going to use that without having to initiate a download. Okay. So here we're saying, we want to use this font, but let's just first check, is it installed? And if it is, great, we'll use that one and we don't need to then initiate the download. So first, do that. The second thing that you want to do is, like, let's say, okay, we're going to download even less, right? So we're going to say, and we're going to create a Unicode range, and we're going to say, we only need these particular letters, so these particular glyphs. So each glyph and set of glyphs in a font file matches a particular Unicode range, and we can find out what that Unicode range is. And in order to do that, we can then do what is called subsetting a font. And by doing that is we actually just removing all the characters that we don't need. Okay. So because OpenType fonts support multiple languages, that makes them a lot bigger. But we can remove all the languages that we don't need. So we can say, okay, I don't need Cyrillic, right? I don't need any Asian languages. My website is only going to be in English, or whatever the case might be. Okay, so I'm just going to do a demo of this, of subsetting a font. And of course, this is where it all goes wrong, right? Can everyone see my terminal?
Yep.
Let me just make it a bit bigger. Okay, so I'm just going to run a command to build and open my, my personal website locally. Okay, so that's running on my local host, and that's what it looks like. Okay. Right. So in this terminal window, I'm in my fonts directory for my site, and you can see there. Sorry, I've got a bunch of a couple of fonts in there. One of which is a 2-type font. Sorry, there's one that shouldn't be there. And let me just get rid of it. Sorry. Excuse me for this. Okay, so you can see I've got Schneider M Demi Web WOFF 2, which is the font I'm using for my headlines. It's that one. And then I'm actually just using Avenir, which is locally installed, so I don't need that. But I've got Playfair Display Regular .ttf, and that's a 2-type format, and I downloaded that from Google Fonts. Right, so there's a program called Glyphhanger, which is developed by the Filament Group. In particular, it was developed by Zach Leatherman, who you may know of. He's the founder and creator of 11T, the static site generator, but he's also considered to be one of the authorities on loading on web font performance. And this is a tool he developed called Glyphhanger. It uses Python, so you can install it on any OS. And it basically runs a set of commands that looks at your typeface and then says, and then allows you to run commands to remove characters and glyphs that you don't want. So what you can do is you can run Glyphhanger command and then a website, and can be any website. It can be one that's on any URL. Here I'm just going to run my local host for my local website, and you'll see it's going to run through that. I'm just running Glyphhanger HTTP local, and there it's returned a Unicode range to me. Okay, and now what it's done is it's looked at the pages on my site, and it's gone, okay, this is the range of characters that are being used, and you can specify. To go deeper, you can specify how many pages you want to look at. So you might have, say, 5 different templates or something like that, and you can set it to do that. So I can see that it's using these this particular Unicode range. So that's all that I need. I don't need anything else. Right? So I can come back here. I'm inside my fonts folder, as we can see, and I'm going to run a Glyphhanger command. That's going to go and whitelist U plus 20 to 7E, which is what I get from my list. And I'm going to subset Playfair Display Regular TTF, which is this font here, and I want my format to be WOFF2. So you can do all these sorts of things with Glyphhanger. You can convert TTF to WOFF2 and to WOFF. If that's all you want to do, you can just do that. You can run Unicode ranges, and you can even generate your font face CSS with it, which is really. So I'm just going to run this command now, and obviously I'm going to hope it works. So what I'm saying here is, give me this Unicode range via the whitelist command flag, subset it, this particular font, and I want this format. And I'm going to hit enter, and it's done. And look at that. It was 230 kilobytes. It's now 27. Okay. Pretty amazing. And I can show you here in my Finder that I now have that subset WOFF2 that's coming in at 28 kilobytes as opposed to 236. Okay. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with Glyphhanger. Help always gives an error, but so you can whitelist, you can create a string, you can actually put it in, you can get a JSON output of all the characters with the JSON flag. You can output CSS as well, and so on. So if I run this and then I go CSS, you see it'll run it again, and there it's gone and created my font face for me. Which we can see there, which I can then just go and copy into my CSS. Very cool tool. So we're taking a big font file, we're converting it to WOFF2, we're stripping out characters we don't need, and we're ending up with a really small file. Okay, so that's subsetting. The other thing we can do is we can initiate a download earlier. So instead of waiting for our CSS to pass and then our font family, we can initiate our download earlier with the preload command. So this goes in the head of our page. We're saying rel preload href would be to our font. We want to download it as a font. What type is it? It's a WOFF2 font, and what's our cross origin? In this case, we want it to be anonymous. So we can do this in the head for each font file that we're downloading. So this actually says, don't wait to tell me what to download, just start downloading it straight away. So it's available immediately. This makes a huge difference to your font loading, and I make a point of always doing it. So it's not render blocking anymore. And then of course what you want to do is you want to cache it with your service worker, and so it downloads once and then it's always available, and you get rid of all the flash of unstyled text and things that you might want. Okay, so I'm actually going to skip over this font face observer because I think it's no longer really a good idea. This was a way of initiating like a font download before CSS by using JavaScript and using a polyfill called the Font Face Observer, which was a polyfill for the font loading API, which ended up never really being implemented in browsers. Bit of a pain because it uses promises, which means it doesn't work in IE11, so you need to polyfill for promises and so on. So Adobe fonts still use this, which is one of the reasons I don't like to use them, because again, we're throwing a JavaScript problem at what I think is a browser download and CSS problem, not a JavaScript one. Right, so we now have a CSS property called font display that allows us to determine whether we're going to have flash of invisible text or flash of unstyled text, and it's called font display, and it's based on a timer. So as soon as the user agent attempts to download a font, this timer starts, and then the timeline is divided into 3 periods, which is block, render, and do nothing. So we have a block period, we have a swap period, and we have a failure period. So in the block period, we're not showing any text or anything until the font's downloaded. In the swap one, we have the fallback font, and then we swap in the custom font. And the failure period says, like, just try and download it, and if after a certain time, give up. You know, we don't want it anymore. Just keep the default. So if we put it in our font face, and we've got those areas: auto, block, swap, fallback, and optional. I always go with swap. Swap says, show me the default, and then show me the custom font as soon as it's downloaded. And if we had to represent that visually, we would see with block, it's invisible. Then we show the fallback after 3 seconds, then the custom. With swap, we show the fallback, then the custom. Fallback, slightly different, and then optional goes whichever one shows up. Yeah. So those are ways to do that. This is really crucial as well. So, 3 things to do. Make sure you're preloading in your HTML head. Make sure you are subsetting. Make sure you are and looking for local. And then finally, make sure that you have a font display property within your font face block. Okay. Fluid and responsive typography. Okay, now if you go and search for this, you're going to find a million articles around fluid and responsive typography. What fluid and responsive typography refers to is how do we scale font sizes over different devices? Because we don't want the same 72-point heading that we have on our 4K monitor on our mobile device, because that's crazy in terms of size. So we wanted to scale, but we wanted to scale proportionally, and we don't want there to be any nasty jumps as we're doing that. So there are a couple of ways in which this can be done, and one of the people who's done a lot of work on this is someone called Mike Reithmuller. Made by Mike is his website, and this is a SAS mixin that he's come up with using calc to do this kind of thing. So what are we talking about when we're talking about fluid typography? So if I scale this, you'll see the font size is going to change, but it's going to change really smoothly without any jumping or anything like that until we get down to our really small sizes, as you can see that. Which is pretty neat, right? Now, this is a really complicated SAS mixin, and Skulk, I'm sure, will concur with me that the cool kids don't use SAS anymore, right?
It depends whether you consider me a cool kid or not.
No, I didn't say you.
Yeah, I haven't used SAS in ages.
Yeah, exactly. Pre-processors have given way to post-processors, have they not? Yeah, so I mean, that's just a SAS mixin. Then you can also get a really complicated one using a whole bunch of CSS variables, yeah? And it does more or less the same thing. Okay. But we have a new thing in CSS, and and that is what we call clamp. Has anyone come across clamp in CSS?
I have.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've been needing it for a couple of years now.
Okay, good. You know, it's only started working in Chrome recently.
Yeah, I know. Which is why I'm highlighting the fact that I've been needing it for years now.
Oh, needing. I thought you said using.
Oh, no. I've been needing it for years now.
Yeah, it's amazing. So clamp uses new CSS values, which are based around min and max, right? So if you get a chance, please do some investigation into CSS min and max, because it's not just min width and min and max width. min height and max height. There's a lot of new sizing elements that we have in CSS, and they have good cross-browser capabilities. Okay, so one of the simple things we can do to make type fluid is to give it a vertical width value instead of a pixel or a point or a character or whatever. So VW says, scale according to the width of the screen. So if I just go font size, can everyone see that? Is it big enough? How's that? If I just go font size 2 VW and then I resize this, you can see it's scaling according to the size of the screen. And that's just one line of CSS with the value. But it's getting way too small, right? We don't want it to be that small. That's unreadable. So what we can do is you can say use calc, and we can say, okay, make it 2 VW, but then let's just bump it up by like 1 EM as well. So we'll just use a simple calc addition, and we'll say, make it a little bit bigger. So you can see as soon as I add that 1 EM, it's going to get a bit bigger. And we can then scale it again, and it's better, but it's still going to get too big and too small. So instead what we can use is the clamp property. Clamp takes 3 values. It says, this is my minimum value, so I can never be smaller than this. In this case, we're going, you can't be smaller than 1M or 16 pixels. Our second one is our ideal value. So we're saying, this is a good value that we like, 2 VW plus 1 EM. And then our third value is our max value. And we're saying, you can never be bigger than this. So in literally one line of CSS, we don't need those anymore. We can say, we can have responsive typography. And all those crazy mix-ins and everything, we don't need them because we've got this. And you can see when we scale it, it scales really nicely in terms of the size. It goes, and it'll never go bigger than 3M. It'll never go smaller than 1M. Now, this is just using SF text as a default font. You could use any different font, and you can obviously make these values whatever you want them to be. Yeah, they can be pixels, they can be points, they can be characters. CSS, you can actually measure things in inches and millimeters. Not that you should, but you can. So we get responsive typography really nice and simply within one line of CSS, and that's really great. So another thing that we can do related to clamp is something called line clamp. Okay, I don't know if you've ever had to truncate a paragraph in CSS. I'm sure we all have had to do that in some time, but you can't do it in CSS. You can only truncate a single line, and you have to resort to some horrible JavaScript nonsense or do bad things on the back end in order to truncate a paragraph. This is usually for use in CMSs, where you'll tell a user, like, please don't make this longer than 3 lines, and they make it 15. It happens all the time. So within a couple of lines of CSS here using WebKit line clamp and WebKit box orient vertical and display WebKit box, we're going to truncate this and automatically add an ellipse on the end. Did you see how that changed? Okay, so there's our long paragraph, and we want to clamp it to only 3 lines. So we'll do that, and there we go. So clamp for responsive and fluid typography, and line clamp for truncating, and very useful. We're taking all of these things around presentation and CSS and display and putting them where they belong in CSS rather than in JavaScript or places where, to my mind, they do not belong. Okay, so, and fine, I'm going to skip vertical rhythm because we're running out of time, I think, right? Or we already have run out of time. And I'm going to go straight into the future. Okay, that's not to say that all the things I haven't talked about are of the past. We still need to be following all those principles, but I think the future of typography on the web is variable fonts. And this is an entire typeface in one font, in one file, that can store a range of design variants. Yeah. So now if we want an italic and a bold and an extra bold and a light and a medium, we have to load all those separate files. It's 5 requests. It's heavy, and it has major performance implications. So if we take, a font like Roboto, for example, in this case, and we want all those styles on the left, those are the font files we'll need to load. There's 12 files, right? I mean, that's madness. We would never do that, I hope. But if we, for some reason, needed to represent all of those font styles, we need to load 12 files. So, I mean, if you use Adobe Tools and if you use Illustrator and you open the character palette, you might see there's a little icon there that appeared in beginning of 2019, maybe earlier, next to the default weight. And when you open that, this is Acumen Variable Content, you now get a space where you can change the weight and the width. Now, normally font weights would go up in multiples of 100. With variable fonts, we have from 0 to 999 for weight, width, slant, whatever it might be. So that all lives within one font face. So you can change, you can make it extra bold, you can make it extra light, you can make it medium, you can change the italic, you can change the width, that is, you can make it condensed, ultra wide, all within the same font file. Yeah. And you don't need to load all those different ones. So we also load these up using font face, but we need to change the format. Yeah. Instead of WOFF2, we have WOFF2 variations, and that tells the browser that this is a variable font. And then if the browser doesn't support variable fonts, it's only IE that doesn't, you just fall back to your standard WOFF2 format. So you can do it like that. With that fallback, you could also use supports, where you just say, okay, please do this. Supports is tricky because you sometimes run into a situation where the browser supports what you want to do, but doesn't support supports, if that makes sense. Safari is a prime culprit in this case. So we have a bunch of CSS properties. Remember earlier I spoke about high level and low level properties. So these at this stage are at a low level, but they are weight, font stretch, font optical sizing, font style italic, font style oblique and angle. And we would do them like this. Font variation settings, weight 823, width 112, ital 1. And that would be a setting for our variable font. The high-level properties will be font weight for WGHT, font stretch for DWTH, and font style italic. So, okay, let's look at a couple of these demos. I promise you we're almost done. So this is a variable font. It's called DecoVar, which is why I've given it this name. I'm going to inspect it. If you don't use Firefox for layout and design, you should be, because it has this amazing fonts panel, which will tell me all the fonts that are used on my page, as well as giving me the font face declaration and all of that. And that works in all browsers. And you'll see here, it says the instance of this font is that it's custom. And we can go and change the size here. We can change the line height. We can change the spacing, which is letter spacing. We can also change the weight. And we can change these values as well, which is really cool. So we can have M or REM or PX or whatever. And you'll see it adds them as an inline style to our HTML element. We can also faux italic. Never faux italic. If you want italic, you need an italic font, right? That's just terrible. Okay, so, but DecoVar is a variable font. Now, with variable fonts, you have those 5 properties earlier that I mentioned, and those are standard. But when you're designing a variable font, you can create your own properties as well. And DecoVar has all these different properties. So I've got them all set to 0, but I'm just going to play around with them. So with DecoVar, you can go inline, and you can, for example, do that. and your typeface has changed completely. I'll reset that. You can go shared, and you'll see it kind of starts to cut the ends off. Yeah. You can make it a rounded slab where it adds a whole bunch of terminals. Stripes will turn it into stripes, and so on. You can change the weight very simply, and you can see how that changes as we go. The worm skeleton, rounded and not rounded, and so on and so on. So these are all variable font properties. Now, one thing that you can also do with variable font properties is that you can actually animate them. Right? So you can set up a variable font. You can create a CSS animation, and then you can apply it to that. So there we go. For example, I'm animating between some variable font properties in this case. There I'm animating the weight, for example. And there I'm animating the terminals. And Firefox will show you also these animations, so you can change various things about them. So that's really how a variable font works. It gives you these additional properties that you can target in CSS, and then you can change the way that those variable fonts look. So here's another, sorry. This thing really gets in the way. So here's another example. Can everyone see the screen still?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So here I've just taken an article by Jeremy Keith, who I think is great and everyone should read, as Scott knows. And it's something he wrote about push notifications and service worker API. And I just used CSS Grid, and I just went and created a kind of 2-column article with some putting the headings on the left and the text on the right, some pull quotes and so on. And this is using a variable font that's called InterUI. And this is what it looks like without the variable fonts activated. And this is what it looks like when I'm going to turn on the variable fonts. You can see that's a way better design, isn't it? So we go from that really boring heading to something that looks like that. And we're only using one font. It's InterUI. If I look at all the fonts on the page, you can see there's only one font that's loaded up here, and it's InterUI variable font. Okay. And all I'm doing there is I'm taking a span and I'm changing the font variation setting, and the color. So I've just put that push in a span, and then I've changed my font variation weight to 650 and my slant to 8. And if I turn that off, you'll see it just goes back to the normal the normal thing it was. So here we can see those particular variable font custom settings. So there's my weight, which I've set to 650, and my slant, which I've set to 8. So I can change that slant however I want, and the weight as well can be updated. And really just doing exactly the same for all these items. So that's just in a span. We've got we've dropped back the spacing, and we've bumped up the weight a little bit to 650. So we wouldn't have, you see this goes from 400 to 900, and that's what's within the particular typeface. And that goes all along, like here, changing the sizes, that's what it normally would look like, changing the size of the block quotes, etc., etc., etc. So without variable fonts, with variable fonts. But it's still only one typeface that's being added to our particular web page in this case. Okay, so I'm almost done. I just want to show you two things. So one is the pitfalls of free fonts, okay? So there's this website called dafont.com, and I went and I selected the most popular sans serif font, which is called Cool Vetica, which should be a red flag immediately. And I put our facade in there with our diacritic, and you can see how it renders that facade. Not fantastic, is it? Yeah, kind of unpleasant. And then I went and I found the most popular serif font, which is called Vogue, and it just ignores it completely. There's just a gap. There's nothing. Yeah. So we need to be really careful with these free fonts. Even ones on Google Fonts. There's one on there that's pretty popular called Oswald that has a really limited character set that I've gotten into trouble with before. So just be careful with the free fonts. They can give you a hard time. And then, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Braid design system of Mark Dalgleish, who is really someone worth following. He has really, really interesting ideas about, in particular, React and design systems. But one of the things they're looking at is, so line height in the browser is not the same as line height in your design tool. Your design tool always works on the baseline, right? So the bottom of the font. The browser doesn't. It creates high line height above and below. And that's often you'll get a designer will come back to you and say, hey, this type isn't right in the browser. And it's not because you've done it wrong. It's because the tool that they're using to design it is not a browser, right? It's Sketch or Figma or whatever it might be. And it's representing those heights differently. So Braid have come up with this thing called Capsize. And I really urge you to go and look at it. There's a talk about it as well. And it's about rethinking how we do sizing in CSS, and getting away from this idea of pixels and ends and all of that. So they're looking at something that they call the cap height, okay, which is not the M, okay, because the M's a little bit bigger than that, but something else. And they've written this ability to create things based on the cap height rather than on an M. And it's really fascinating. I don't have time to go into it, but I really, really suggest looking into this. I think it's the future of how we're going to do CSS. And this tool will give you what you want this to be via, plain old JavaScript, CSS, and JS, or good old CSS. And you see it's creating font sizes at a really crazy pixel thing. But what it's also doing is it's adding pseudo-generated content with margins at the top and the bottom. And what this does is it actually emulates the design tools use of the baseline absolutely perfectly. Yeah. So it's a really, really interesting thing. And I think it's really worth looking into this because I'm a designer as well as a front-end developer, but I'm pragmatic about the browser because I know what it can and can't do. But I think for most of us, when we're working with designers, and this isn't a dissing designers in any way whatsoever, they're not always aware of all the constraints that we have in the browser. And that's often where we get pushback, especially on things like typography. And it's not because we've done it wrong, it's because the browser it's not going to emulate the design tool. But it's really a problem with the design tool, that design tools that we have don't work well when we're translating those things into the browser. So what Sketch tells us is not really what we should be using in the browser. And this kind of tool is something that mitigates against that. I mean, I don't know if people use Figma a lot, but Figma line height is an absolute nightmare. One of the reasons why I don't ever use it because of that is that I never get a good correlation between what Figma tells me and what the browser is telling me. Yeah, I think that's it. I have one more slide. There we go.
Cool, thanks a lot. That was quite a lot. Like I'm pretty sure a lot of people are going to be very happy that we're recording this for YouTube. I know myself, I'm probably going to review this Let me just move my window.
Yeah, I realized it was a bit dense. It maybe could have been 2 talks.
No, don't ever apologize for giving too much information. Yeah, no, it's great stuff. It's interesting, like, because I've obviously seen some parts of this talk over the years, and it's kind of interesting to see how the actual talk itself develops as time goes on.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah,
I mean, I could probably give this talk every 3 months, and it would be different, yeah, because browsers are moving so fast, and tools and ways, and I think also people are starting to think really interesting ways about web type, and we're kind of getting over our obsession with pixel perfect, thank goodness.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is still a thing. Maybe before we dive into some questions, like something I personally would like to know is what are maybe good resources in terms of if you want to delve deeper into this, if you want to get a better sense of typography on the web and so forth. What can people look at? Maybe I remember that one from my college days.
This book is old, but it's brilliant. Type on Screen by Ellen Lupton. I don't know how Lupton, sorry. Really amazing. She's director of the Design MFA at Maryland School of Design, which is regarded to be one of the
She
best,
has quite a couple of design books.
Yeah, she does. You can also just search for her website. She's got loads of articles on there as well, and she really specializes in type for the screen. So this is a great book. It should be available by ebook and whatnot. I'm actually gonna share a couple of books.
That would be amazing.
This book by Richard Ratter. It's called Web Typography. Richard Ratter, he writes a ton of stuff about web type. He's really excellent on variable fonts. This is called A Handbook for Designing Beautiful and Effective Responsive Typography. Also, it's also available. You can get it as a PDF. I actually, it was a Kickstarter actually that I backed. And this came out last year. So it's fairly recent and up to date. Of course, the problem with books is they quickly get out of date unless they're very general. This is very specific, but it's new. So I would definitely try and get it. The kind of legendary designer Eric Spiekerman said that, and I quote, "very useful." So
powerful words.
And then this is one of my favorite books. It's also available. It's called Designing for Legibility. And it's by Sophie Bayer, and it's just got like tons of really great examples of making type legible and so on. It's not technical from a coding point of view, but it's a great resource for like just learning about what makes a typeface legible, what are the components of a typeface, how do we look at them, how do we read them, etc. Now I know books are they can be inaccessible because they're hard to get sometimes and obviously expensive, but those should be available as PDFs. Otherwise, the Adobe fonts, before they became Adobe fonts, they were Typekit. And Typekit blog, the Typekit blog is an amazing resource, and it's being kept by Adobe. It's updated all the time. Check that out for loads, especially around open type features. They're really good on that. Then there's Zach Leatherman, who I mentioned earlier, who created that Glyphhanger where I showed you about, where I demoed that. His personal website, just do a search for Zach Leatherman. He's got like all these different examples of font loading, and where you can go and look at the timings and stuff like that and see what the best technique for you is. Really good and really comprehensive. So from a performance point of view, I definitely check that out. What else? Variable fonts, yeah, definitely check out Richard Ratter's stuff. Also just do a search for Variable Fonts Playground, and you'll find a website that collects all the kind of known variable fonts that are out there, because it's very new technology. There are not a lot of them, and you can then go and like it's almost the same kind of tool as what Firefox has in their inspector for fonts, where you can go and play around with the different values and stuff, and you can download the free ones and so on. A lot of Google fonts are now variable as well. So if you want to start using variable fonts, you can download them from Google Fonts as well.
Okay.
What else? There's I Love Typography, which is a great resource just for.
It's been a while since I've heard geez, I used to visit that so much. Now, like it's been a while.
Yeah. There's also Fonts in Use, which is you can go and search for a font, and then it'll show you examples of how it's been used in print and online and websites and apps and so on. And then a similar thing to that is Jeremiah Shove has a website called TypeWolf, which I subscribe to his newsletter. And he also does a similar thing where you can go and search for Typeface and you can see how it's being used around the web. He'll tell you what the font is, where you can get it, and he'll link to both commercial and free foundries and all sorts of stuff. It's a really, really excellent resource. I would really recommend subscribing to his newsletter. He sends it out. It's not spammy at all. It's just a couple of links to new sites that you can go and look at that are using typography in an interesting way. And then there's also Robin Rendell, who he's one of the editors at CSS Tricks, but he also writes a lot about typography on the web. He's really well worth reading as well. Those are good things. I mean, there's so many type resources.
Oh, tell me about it. Yeah.
And even, so that's just scraping the surface. Yeah.
So yeah, there's a pretty recent one as well that I followed, I think maybe 2 years ago, called Better Web Type. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. So like, if you want something a bit more recent as well, like that's also worth checking out. Then you mentioned Filament Group quite a bit. Are there any other like groups or kind of agencies or like I guess practitioners that you would maybe advise people to follow in terms of just looking at what they do with typography?
Yeah, so Mandy Michael.
Okay. You might need to spell that for us.
Let me just find her website.
Is it Mandy?
Mandy, yeah.
Oh, okay. No, okay. Mandy Michael. Okay. It's not that hard.
MandyMichael.com.
Oh, fair enough.
She's got some really amazing stuff that she does with variable fonts. And she speaks a lot about them as well. She's got a lot of online talks that she's given at conferences and things on variable fonts. She does a lot of that. She's from Australia. She also runs the front-end dev meetup in Perth, actually. So she's really worth following for that. Richard Rutter, I've mentioned. She's off the top of my head, it's difficult. I'll tell you what, I'll put together like a GitHub repo for everyone.
Jeez, yeah, that's a great idea.
Just with links and resources, and then we can send it out to the meetup members. Just give me a little time to do it. Yeah.
There's also a question here of like how did your journey into typography start?
A long time ago. So my father was actually a graphic designer.
Okay.
And he was actually the dean of the design faculty at the Cape Technicon. So I kind of grew up around design a lot, and they were always like Graphist magazines and all these design stuff. And when I was a kid, I'm reasonably old, like letter sets and stuff like that. I don't know if anyone is old enough to remember that stuff, but it was like you would rub letters. You'd get a sheet with like Helvetica, and it would be all the like five uppercase A's, 5 lowercase a's, and all the letters and numbers and punctuation, and you had this special tool, and you'd like rub it onto paper, and it would come out, and you'd have this print-worthy thing. It was amazing. And you know, when I was really young, my father always had tons of that stuff, and I was always playing around with it, and just devouring like all the magazines that you get and books and everything around that. Yeah, that's where it really started. That just fascinated me so much. And my one uncle was actually a typesetter, so he used to do like movable type. Actually, there we go.
Yeah, I had one of those as well.
yeah. So I mean, all just really my upbringing and background got me interested in it. Yeah. And my dad used to freelance when he was obviously an academic, but he used to do a lot of freelance design. So I learned a lot then from him as well, and just watching him do hand lettering and stuff like that. So,
yeah.
And then we got a Mac in like, I don't know when, like I was young, when we got a Mac for the first time, one of the first Macs, and it had the first Macs were the first personal computers to not have bitmap fonts. They actually had like proper typefaces on them. Yeah, and I used to spend a lot of time like in black and white on them.
Yeah, I see.
So all way back then,
Yeah, I see. Vin asks about. Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
No. I mean, that's really it. Yeah, and then obviously getting into digital design later on, and then into the web. And I started building websites like at the beginning of the web, really, where you could only use type. It was all you had. Yeah, there was nothing else. So it's always fascinated me, and I've always felt it's the most important part of what we do.
Yeah. I see Vin asks if you remember Garth Walker and iJusi.
Yes,
I remember.
yes.
Yeah. Like I actually did a couple of postgrad papers on them. And yeah, like there was definitely like this kind of like this period where everyone was like fascinated with hand lettering and like kind of what would be called back then vernacular typography. Like I think it coincided with, I don't know if you remember, like the like it was also like the mission school thing. I don't know if you know about that. Or was it around the time that what's a Beautiful Losers? Have you ever watched that? Yeah, around the time that came out, and like everyone was just going nuts about like hand lettering and things. Unfortunately, like obviously for obvious reasons, that doesn't translate that well onto the web.
No, it doesn't work on the screen at all, really.
Yeah. But no, I remember that. Like typography was kind of like it's interesting. Like it kind of feels like it died down a bit. Like there was definitely, or maybe I'm just less and less involved in the kind of the graphic design space and getting more and more involved in like kind of interface design. But like it feels to me like there was a time when like everyone was like just super curious and interested in typography.
Yeah, I think the early days of the web, to some extent, killed that curiosity a little bit because it was so limited, right? You couldn't really do anything. For so long, we could only choose between like 6 fonts, right? 5 of them were terrible. I actually think the only good one is Vidana, actually.
I still today I still use Vidana at anything under 11 pixels.
It's a really, really good screen font. I wouldn't use it outside of the screen ever, but it's a really, really good screen font.
It's my go-to font for anything smaller than 11 pixels, regardless of what the design says. If you're going to make design a font that small, I'm going to use Vidana. I'm going to replace your custom nice thing that renders vector in your design program with Vidana.
I see Vin has mentioned Massimo Vignelli. So I was actually going to mention him, but then I didn't. So his like design his whole thing was like you only ever need like, I think it was correct me if I'm wrong, maybe even 6 typefaces throughout your entire design career. I think it was 6. I can't remember exactly which they were. Helvetica was definitely one of them, and Bodoni. I can't remember the others. So, I mean, Massimo Vignelli, he did the whole New York subway system. I mean, I guess that's probably what he's most well known for. But I mean, his whole thing was you don't need a 1,000.
But that's kind of at the height of like kind of the modernist thing, where you could like just reduce everything down to just like something
as well, right? Like function over form. Yeah, the font is not expressive in any way. The typeface is purely to convey information. There's no aesthetic flourish allowed.
Yeah, what's that article?
I kind of like. I like that kind of utilitarian approach. You know?
Yeah, like I also did until I kind of realized that I think like there's a lot of gatekeeping going on there. In terms of, like people being like, I'm an expert in typography, you know. But what's that?
Elitist.
Yeah. What's that? Like, there's this well-known article as well. I think it's called the Crystal Goblet. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yes.
Yeah. Geez, that takes me back. Yeah.
I remember that one.
Yeah.
Prescriptive is not the word, right?
Okay, cool.
Right.
Cool. I actually, like, maybe I should just open the floor a bit. There's been some text questions. I don't know if anyone has any questions they want to ask over video or audio.
Yeah. Is anyone?
I definitely have a couple.
Go for it.
Okay, let's do this. So, is there ever a reason why you wouldn't want to preload your fonts?
No.
Why is it not default browser behavior?
Yeah. So this is a question that's been
browsers
asked a lot.
hate us. That's why.
Yeah. And there's some conflicting viewpoints on this, but one of the reasons is that because of the way the CSS ARM works, it's just too difficult to re-engineer.
Okay.
Yeah. So, there are a lot of things that around the way CSS works in certain ways that are constrained by the legacy of CSS itself.
No, sure.
And the way it was
JavaScript as well.
And it's not just around this. Font face it wasn't something that was ever considered, Tim Berners-Lee always thought that stylistic kind of enhancements to web pages shouldn't be prescribed by anybody. I don't mean anybody, I mean any like official standards body. He always thought it should be the browser makers who decide how they want things to render in their particular browser.
Interesting.
Which is a terrible idea now.
Yeah.
But back then, why he wanted that? Because he wanted the web to be neutral, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of people have lots of misconceptions about him. One notable one is like he's very much in favor of there just being one browser.
Very much not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So another question I have is you mentioned VWs, VH, and so forth. I've kind of heard like some comments over the last couple of years that might have accessibility problems. I don't know if you...
Yeah, it does. But with clamp, you're specifying a minimum and a maximum. So that solves your accessibility problems. The accessibility problems with VW and VH is that if a screen gets too small, then the type is too small to be legible. That's the accessibility problem. But if you specify a minimum with clamp, I mean that in the example I did 1M or 16 pixels, then you're making it accessible because it's never going to go smaller than that. Yeah.
No, for sure. And I think
I would never do that without clamp. Yeah, I would never just go make it this use VW because you never know what someone's screen resolution is going to be, right?
I also think like some of it is just because it's not REM as well. So this is kind of contested, but you know, a lot of people have strong feelings about using pixel instead of REM.
I don't.
I don't know. Like I like using REM just because I like the fact that it's like the granularity of it is less. So it's a lot easier to just tell the developer to use like 0.5, 1, 2, and let's say 6 REM, and that's kind of my scale, than it is to kind of communicate that. I guess like the pixels are harder for me to just remember.
No, I agree with that. I also use REM, and I've started to use actually CH, or the character unit, where
interesting.
1 CH is equal to the width of an X. So, and I find this is really good for line length, because in line length you want you don't want your lines, particularly in dense like body text, to be too wide, because then they become really hard to read. So with CH you can actually limit that, and then it's not dependent on how big your font is. So you can say, so I usually use around 70 CH for a text column as a max, because that allows you to then cap it at characters, which means you're always looking at something, a line that's going to be readable. Whereas if you do percentages or M's or M's or VW, sorry, you're starting to look at variable widths, and that can make your lines hard to read. So. Yeah, and I feel less prescriptive about units than I used to. And I think there are 2 reasons for that. The one is that browser scaling isn't the issue it used to be. Like people scaling their font sizes and whatnot. I mean, it still is an issue to some extent if people change it globally, but that's always going to be an issue. People just hitting Command plus or whatever a couple of times on your website, and you've got things done in pixels, it's not really much of an issue anymore.
Yeah.
And also with grid, you can mix and match units of measure. So you can create grid columns, and you can have one that's 200 pixels, one that's 20%, one that's 1 FR, and one that's ETH. And grid doesn't mind; it likes that. So I think we need to be a little less prescriptive about what units of measure we use. But this is a big argument, and it's been
I just wanted to say that's fighting words.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, my general take is that, you know, like browsers have also made it increasingly harder to independently set the font size. So if you're able to actually do that, then you're probably just better off like loading your own custom CSS through like a browser extension or something.
Definitely.
That just overrides the font size completely. So yeah, I don't know. Like I like REM, so I just stick with REM. But I don't have strong.
REM is great, but REM is great if your designer is working in multiples of 8 and 16. REM is not great if they're working on a different scale. Like if you need to convert 42 pixels to REM, it's a pain.
No.
You can use Calco and whatnot, or if you use SAS, it's really easy. But so I think we also need to train designers a little bit to work with a good scale, and not rather than an arbitrary one, or work in multiples of 10 or something like that. It's no good. We should be working always in multiples of 16.
Yeah. I think that's all from my side. I think maybe in closing, the last question from my side is, so variable fonts, if I understand correctly, the actual variables themselves are defined by the font.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it uses an open type font table, like a normal open font type font does. And within an open type font, you would have a table that that will allow multiple languages. It will allow multiple glyphs, diacritics, fractions, open type features, all those types of things. And the variable font version of an open type font just adds to that open type table. So it just adds, when you say, okay, weight between 400 and 900 and increment by 1, you're just adding another column, you're just adding another item to that font table. And that's how they all work here, for all those properties. And you can add whatever you want.
Also, please convince me that we're not making a massive mistake by like giving people this power. There's a side of me that's very scared.
I suspect we are. In some ways.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see some, I think if variable type becomes if it takes off in a big way, it hasn't, it really hasn't. It's still very niche. I don't think many people are using variable fonts at all. It's tiny. But now Google's supplying them, you know. So now there's going to be a huge jump, I imagine. But, you know, when I showed you that Decovar one and I added that animation and stuff, like I would never actually do that, you know?
Yeah, but that's what scares me is whenever I read an article on variable fonts or see an example, that's like the stuff that always gets shown, which is fine because you kind of want to illustrate kind of the scope of it.
Yeah, it's just to show the possibilities, Like me, horses and things with a font, you know. I mean, if you go and search variable fonts on CodePen, there's some crazy stuff on there that people are doing with the fonts.
But I'm scared, like, because that's kind of the de facto example, that's what people are going to start doing.
No, exactly. People are going to load up a like 300 kilobyte font file because that's how big it needs to be to have all those things in it to show us, and it's got like one character in it that animates, you know, and it's not even, you know, and that's it. And meanwhile, you can do that and animate it in
SVG
8 kilobytes, you know, and inline it and cache it and whatnot.
Yeah.
So I see some ugliness on its way, but I think it will die out. Yeah. You know how when we first got like text shadow?
Oh, geez.
Way back in the day. And everything had text shadow.
Text shadow,
Like body text had text shadow. It was hideous.
Yeah.
But we don't see that anymore, right?
Yeah.
But when we had border radius, everything was suddenly rounded.
Yeah, I just wanted to say border radius. And we're not talking here about like material design, like 6 pixels, 4 pixels. We're talking about like everything was like 30 pixels.
No, of course, yeah.
It looked like Duplo.
And box shadow, right?
Yeah.
Everything had 5 box shadows, 3 inner shadows, a gradient, and a 50 pixel border radius, and text shadow. that changed on hover, so it looked like you were indenting it when you pressed it, you know, stuff like that. So those things all came out at the same time, and we had this huge flurry of, you know, we must use these new properties. You know, text, shadow, all the things. I think we're going to get variable font, all the things, a little bit.
I'm also concerned that
things that shouldn't be animated. We already have so many things that shouldn't be animated that are animated. This is going to add to that. So I think there's going to be a lot of noise.
But such is the web, you know. You named all the examples of like border radius and so forth. That's just like the ebb and flow of the web.
What I you know, I don't. If this becomes a thing that everyone who builds websites, you know, let's say WordPress websites, for example, suddenly starts, you know, animating all the things with variable fonts. You know, it's fine, whatever. But that sounds condescending. I don't mean it that way. I mean,
you mean like,
I mean, it's not going to take off and become a big thing if that happens. If some really high-profile place, like let's say everyone copies Stripe, right? If Stripe suddenly come out with animated variable, then it's the end. It's the end for us because that will be the trend for the next year and a half.
Yeah, I'm like just disabling CSS on like everything, like straight up in my browser. No more CSS. on any
disabling
side.
JS to disabling CSS because of those damn variable fonts.
Yeah, I think my big concern is that like like things have been going nice now, and we've kind of moved away from icon fonts to SVGs and so forth.
Yeah, yeah.
I think one of my concerns with variable fonts is that that's maybe going to cause a bit of a resurgence in icon fonts, because
It really
theoretically, just thinking about it, like it is actually very convenient, because now you have kind of like a component-based icon system
Yeah,
that you
I
can
definitely
kind
see
of,
that happening. Yeah,
yeah.
because of all the things that you can do with it,
Mm,
your sizing becomes so easy, which it
mm,
always was. But now
mm,
you're sizing, you've got one font that you're sizing. It's really easy. You can
mm.
change outlines, you can change weights, you can change
Exactly.
all these kinds of things.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
and you can have multiple colors within variable fonts as well.
Mm,
So if you want more than one color icon, you can do
mm,
that within a variable font.
mm,
Which you couldn't do in a standard icon font.
mm,
And then, of course, you can animate it.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I think icon fonts were great when we needed to support browsers that were terrible with SVGs,
Mm,
i.e. 11 in
mm,
particular, or i.e. 10 even back then. And
mm,
they served a purpose then.
mm.
But there's so many issues with icon fonts, from
Yeah.
private use, what am I thinking of? Unicode ranges and things
Mm.
like that, where your icon just wouldn't render, or
Or yeah, like what had happened to me quite a bit is I would just get the wrong one. For like,
yeah, exactly.
I
Yeah.
I remember like I had a site at some point where, like, I don't know why, but all the icon fonts just changed to that emoji of the flexing of the flexing arm. I still don't know why. But yeah.
Yeah, there's so many issues with them. And of course, the same problem that you have with any font is, how do you initiate the download?
Mm, mm,
Again, you've got to declare that icon font as a font family,
yeah,
and your CSS has to
and
pass. And
that doesn't even touch on like accessibility issues. Like fonts
terrible
are meant for
accessibility.
text, not icons.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and because they're always using generated and pseudo content,
Mm,
they're just terrible for accessibility.
mm. Cool. So I think we can end it on that note. Hopefully, in 2 years, you won't be doing a talk about like why variable fonts was a bad idea. Let's
Variable
hope
fonts.
for the best. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. But this was some super great. This is some super dense stuff. I'm definitely gonna review it a couple of times. And yeah, like I think like if you're up for it, a GitHub repo with typography.
Yeah, I'll definitely put that together. I mean, I'm
Mm.
just going to need a couple of weeks to do it.
Yeah, isn't there like a type of an awesome list, like a web typography, awesome web typography or something?
There probably is.
Because if there's not, like that's maybe not a bad idea.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'll do some digging.
Hmm.
This stuff is mostly in my head these days, so I don't really go and look anymore. But I'll definitely go and do some digging. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. All right. Cool. Thanks everyone for joining, and then thanks to everyone who's still stuck around to the end. I know it's getting quite late now.
Thanks everyone. Appreciate your time.
So maybe sure. Now I'm kind of regretting that. Like I said, I'm going to do like housekeeping at the end. But yeah. So for those interested, we will be having a talk again on the 5th of August.
Next week.
Yeah, which is in a week. What's the guy's name? Yang? Or was his surname Yang? Yeah. So he's the creator of Plasmic, which is kind of a React tool for building design systems, interface libraries and stuff like that. So not only is he going to share his tool with us, he's also going to go a bit into like kind of the challenges he faced while building the tool and kind of the process that he followed and so forth. And yeah, I'm actually excited because since we started organizing that, I've been seeing a lot of people sharing Plasmic. So I haven't taken the effort to actually delve into it and see what it involves. But yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. So yeah, as always, you can learn more on our meetup page, or you can like us, I don't know what it's called, follow us on LinkedIn. Just search for Front End Development South Africa.
We also have a Twitter account.
Oh yeah, and a Twitter, which is just the acronym FedSA-community, correct? And a one word without the dash. Yeah. Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening. Then hopefully I'll see most of you next week. Cool.
And I'll just pop everyone a message via Meetup when I get the repo together.
I'll also post a message on the Meetup when the video is up on YouTube.
Okay, cool. And we'll do the same on LinkedIn and ZA Tech and so on.
Yeah, cool.
Oh, by the way, while we're here,
yes.
I know there's only a few people there, but there's a new South African Slack group. It's called ZA PD or ZA Product Design, which is aimed more for designers than developers. So ZA Tech is very dev heavy. So there's also ZA PD. I'm just gonna pop the.
I see Vin. Yeah, I see Vin shared that, but I didn't get around to asking it. Yeah, it's is it? I know. What's the place? IO has been pushing it quite hard. Are they involved?
Eagle Bester from IO's, and I'm actually one of the admins on there. So.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm joining it as we speak.
Yeah, I've just popped the link in the chat. So I mean, and also share it around. We're planning some meetups on that side as well. So with around design systems and things like that.
Okay, I'm going to get my students to join it as well.
Good idea.
Cool. All right, everyone.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Cheers.
See you around.